Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of the Big Sky Down podcast. As always, I'm your host, Josh Amick, with my trusted panel, John, Fritz, Mark, and Ian. Believe it or not, we are already heading into Week 10, just 3 games left in the regular season before playoffs begin, so a lot of things are happening in the conference. So let's get right into it. Probably the best game over the weekend was Idaho State prevailing at home over Sacramento State, 30-27 in overtime. Do we think it's fair to say it's a wrap on the season for the Hornets at Sac State? And are the Bengals a rising team with having just those close losses early on in the season and now kind of getting things going? Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, that loss might have done it for Sac State. What are they, 3-5 overall, 1-3 in the conference, and if they win out, they're 7-5, and that's kind of on the edge. Optimistically, probably not anyway. They might not get in even at 7-5 if they win out. And you look at 2 of those games, they got to go to Montana State in a couple weeks, and they got UC Davis at home in the finale. So I think that might be it for Sac State. As far as ISU, I mean, yeah, they are a rising team because they couldn't have gone down any farther the last few years. But they have done well. I mean, they played Montana State tough at home, then they lose it at home to Portland State. Then they play NAU tough in Flagstaff and at 7,000 feet, and then they beat Sac State. So yeah, they're a team on the rise, and so it's kind of neat to see that over here, to see Idaho State, making strides and trying to be competitive in that league.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think this loss kind of does Sac State in terms of their playoff hopes. Just really just look like a completely different team from a year ago. I know they're looking to build off of that playoff appearance they had and the win they had last year. But I mean, for Idaho State, I mean, first of all, what a stand by their defense on that last drive of regulation. Sac State marches it down to the 6-yard line for first and goal, and then they hold them to a field goal. I know that Idaho State defensive back is also a little relieved after looks like he maybe could have got that interception. It was either on that last drive or the first drive of overtime. I don't remember. But he's got to be relieved that they ended up coming out with that win. So, but yeah, big win for Idaho State. Definitely on the rise. And for Sac State, it's going to be really tough, man. Like Mark mentioned, they play Montana State and UC Davis. I just don't see how they can get 4 wins from here on out.
Yeah, I agree. I think Sac State's pretty toast. Andy Thompson he's their head coach and has a nice reputation as a D coordinator. And maybe he's one of those like, Vance Joseph and Brian Flores right now in the NFL. They're way better as a DC, or it goes way better as when they're DC than when they're a head coach. And, Wade Phillips, great defensive coordinator, didn't have it as a head coach. So maybe that's the deal with Andy. And yeah, like Mark mentioned, there's really no place for Idaho State to go but up. They won the turnover battle and won the game, although it obviously went to overtime. And I think it's good for the league if the Bengals are solid middle of the pack or rising to the top. It's been a while. They've been through a lot of coaches, and seems like Cody Hawkins has some staying power.
Don't really have too much to add there. I mean, Fritz mentioned the turnover margin that last game with Idaho State winning. It was great to see them kind of, maybe they still gave up the points, but getting a scoop and score, they stripped Tout Oliver on what would have been a touchdown for Sac State, the interception of Conklin. And Sac State just shot themselves in the foot, missed a field goal, the goal line stand at the end of the game, like Ian mentioned. So it's just kind of been a rough season for Sac State. I feel like there's been a lot of teams that we could kind of mention that have that ability to go out and win games, but then on a week-by-week basis, they're not showing it all the time. So, but yeah, I'd love to give some credit to Idaho State for, standing tall at home. It's a tough opponent coming into Pocatello, and they definitely looked like they could have had a good solid season this year if their defense maybe stepped up on just a couple more drives.
Yeah, I like how you bring that up because I'm just curious how different we talk about Idaho State if they pull off those wins against Portland State. And NAU is always tough to win. in Flagstaff. But just getting that win over Portland State, they're a 5-4 team and 3-2 in Big Sky instead of 4-5 and 2-3. So curious to see what happens the rest of the season for the Bengals. And then Sac State, I know they were trying to bid to get in the Pac-12. I don't know if that's going to work out after the way they performed this year. But moving on to another team, Jack Layne finally returned for the Vandals. They get their starting quarterback back, led them to a 38-28 victory over Eastern Washington. Did he provide a spark for the Vandals offense, or was this more so about the opponent and Eastern having a pretty lackluster defense, Ian?
Yeah, I mean, Layne, I think in the beginning of the game maybe looked a little rusty, and I think that was kind of to be expected. But as the game progressed, I mean, he looked pretty good. He also didn't look afraid to get re-injured. I mean, he was kind of running around a lot, standing in the pocket, diving forward instead of sliding at times. So that they got to be a little bit excited to see that. I know Coach Eck after the game was saying it was great to see him back out on the field. But I mean, for Eastern, I mean, obviously it's not great for your defense to give up 38 points. But I mean, when you're in a kind of a shootout game like that ended up being, and the offense doesn't score in the third quarter, whether it's that goal line stand and also the fumble, it just kind of fades away your chances. I know they ended up playing a little bit of touchdown ping pong at the end there in the fourth quarter where each team gets a couple scores. But if the defense is able to get maybe a stop or two, it's a completely different game in that one.
Yeah, I think Eastern's greatest attribute is the way they recover onside kicks. They got another one Saturday. The problem was they threw a pick right away, right after it, and lost by 10. Hey, before I go further, can I get a pronunciation guide on this cup that they played for? The Sheskow? Anybody know that one?
Cheeskow.
Sheskow.
Yeah, Cheney in Moscow. Or Moscow.
That's it? Okay.
That's it. Cheesko. Yeah.
I suppose I could have figured that out eventually.
Very, very creative with the name.
Well, I'm sure Jason Eck came up with it in about 5 seconds because I think it used to be the Governor's Cup, and what kind of name is that? Who cares?
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. Well, talking about Layne, there's a reason he was the number one quarterback, and I'll hit that same note here in next question too. He came out of camp as number one. I thought he looked pretty polished after the slow start. And the other thing that really struck me, beyond the things that Ian mentioned, was Deshaun Buchanan tearing off those long runs. Suddenly he's number 2 on the team in rushing touchdowns. It's a redshirt freshman. That was his 5th game, and he looked great. And I don't know where Idaho's finding all these guys, but they seem to have a pipeline going.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like Idaho's got to be happy to A, get through a whole game without a quarterback injury, and B, have their number one guy from the preseason back. And I mean, he looked the part. He went out there and, it wasn't maybe a standout game on the stat sheet, but if you actually watch the game and everything, you see he did everything right, except for the one interception. But Eastern, giving up 500 yards. I know Ian mentioned the points and giving up 38 points, but when you give up almost 500 yards, you're going to be in trouble. That seems to just kind of be what they do nowadays. Fritz always brings up that 2022 quarterfinal against Montana as the turning point, but yeah, it seems like from that moment on, they just haven't been able to put the defense together.
Yeah, like Fritz mentioned earlier about Jack Layne being the number one. There's a reason he was the number one quarterback coming out at camp. He was their best guy, most experienced guy for a redshirt sophomore. And kind of just listening to coaches talk through the season, once he was healthy, he was going to play. I know there was some talk on here and going with the hot hand with one of the other quarterbacks, even if Layne was healthy. But once he was healthy, he was back in there, and you could kind of see why. You look at Eastern, and it's kind of hard to say. They played pretty well on defense for giving up 487 yards, but it wasn't a terrible. I mean, they weren't shredded. They stacked the box and tried to stop the run. I guess they didn't really with 200 and whatever yards that Idaho got, although a couple of them were long runs. But their defense wasn't terrible. And you look at that turning point that when it was 17-13 first drive of the third quarter, and Eastern's going down there to score. They're 1 yard away from taking the lead, and they get stopped on fourth down, and then Idaho goes down and scores, and then Eastern throws a pick. Idaho goes down and scores, and pretty soon they have a margin to kind of finish off the game. So wasn't it? It was hard to be encouraged if you're Eastern, because what are they now? 2-6, and so, but that was kind of something they could, feel sort of good about. That 2 years ago they got crushed down there. It was like 49-12.
I'm glad that Fritz, you brought up Buchanan, because when I was looking at this recap, I caught some of the game at the office. But yeah, Buchanan running for 116 yards and 2 touchdowns on just 8 carries. So whatever Eastern was doing on defense was not working, and we've talked about the run defense all season long. But I do want to ask you guys, I think the second or third time we brought up this 2022 Eastern team. Did they have a different defensive coordinator then, or what has changed since 2022 to now, where it seems like they have very little defense at all?
Who wants that one?
I'll let you take it. That was before my time here.
You're the history guy, so
no, I haven't really seen any turnover on the Eastern staff, and I just think they've recruited really well. It seems like they always have a quarterback, and there's been a couple times through the years where Montana passed on guys that wound up at Eastern and played great defense. J.C. Sherritt comes to mind. They've had some great players through the years. Greg Beach. They're just really not any real blue chipper on that side of the ball right now, and I just think it's a matter of they're in a down cycle, and Travis Best has been there for 7 or 8 seasons, so it's kind of hard to really expect it happening or predict it. It's just where we are, and the line of demarcation seems to be them having to come here and play that quarterfinal game after beating the Grizz at home in 2022. And Eric Barriere was a heck of a player, and now they've got 3 quarterbacks that are pretty good. And they interchange them, and maybe that's the key too. Maybe if you have 3 quarterbacks, you have 0 quarterbacks. But as far as turnover, and I don't see that as the issue. I just think they just haven't quite got the dudes.
Yeah, Barriere kind of made up for a lot of defensive inefficiencies, because they would just outscore the other team, and now they're losing those games. Their quarterbacks are still good. They're just not him. So instead of winning 57-41, now they're losing 57-41.
Yeah, and they have a new defensive coordinator this year, but it's not just a this year issue. It's kind of stemmed the last couple of years as well. So it's not something that just came to Cheney in the last 9 months or so.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Curious to see what happens with Eastern at the end of this year. I feel like some changes are definitely needed for that team. But all this talk about quarterbacks leads us into the next perfect topic, with Montana winning 24-0. But for most of the game, they did use 2 quarterbacks. Do you think with Montana specifically, this method of using 2 quarterbacks has a chance for them to be successful? Or do you think eventually they go back to just using 1 for the rest of the season, Fritz?
Yeah, I thought it was kind of looking we were on the verge of having Logan Fife out there 100% of the time. But there was kind of a lively debate around these parts in Missoula that if Keali Ayat is healthy, they got to play him, don't they? Because he was a quarterback coming out of fall camp. And that it's been a long time since they've been able to establish a quarterback and have him come back for a second or third, or in Ayat's example, maybe a 4th season or 5th, because he played a little bit last year and was able to keep his redshirt. So now he's a redshirt freshman. And I think as the year goes on, they might kind of pick one or the other. It's a volatile position, as Bobby Houck says ad nauseum. And Ayat throws a great deep ball. We saw it again Saturday against Northern Colorado. He maybe doesn't get through his progressions quite as decisively as Fife. I think that's Fife's strength. But I think as long as Ayat's healthy, they're going to play him a majority of the time and be successful.
Yeah, I do wonder how much of it was them wanting to just kind of let Ayat maybe resettle in after that Western Carolina game where he took that big shot. He went back out there, but then for one more drive and ended up having that, getting that record tying touchdown. But then they sat him for the rest of the game, and he really hasn't made too many appearances since then. So I wonder if maybe before the bye they tried to ease him back in and then give him that extra week off to kind of get him back into the starting lineup. I don't know. I kind of went into this weekend thinking that it would be Fife again, just because that's what we've seen the past few weeks from Montana. But Ayat getting out there on that second drive, and he led up the first two touchdown drives, I believe, for Montana on that one. So he showed that he's back and healthy now, and it makes me wonder if he's going to be the go ahead guy this coming week, or if they will split it between them. I don't think personally that splitting them is going to be good for this team, because it's hard to establish a rhythm, and I feel like they struggle already early on in games to get into a rhythm. But it's something that I think the coaching staff will have to look at throughout the week.
Yeah, and the one thing coaches would never admit is if they went into this game thinking, well, we could play two quarterbacks and get through it this way, this week, playing both equally and stuff. But I think in the future, yeah, like Fritz said and you guys said, you got to pick one and go with him. And if you want to give the other guy a series or something just to kind of keep him fresh, that's fine. Some of the teams in the league kind of have different change of pace quarterbacks. Like Idaho's got a running quarterback, and Eastern has a Coke, and Eastern has a running quarterback in Taylor, and I can see subbing them in that way to do things like that. But I think with Montana, they kind of got to decide who their guy is and go with them, and maybe give the other guy a series or two in a game. But I don't think they can kind of go back and forth through a game and keep the continuity like you guys said.
Yeah, I don't have any new opinions here. I've just never really been a fan of two or more quarterback systems in games. Like John mentioned, I think there is something to getting a rhythm offensively, starting out. I mean, even like bouncing back from if you have a turnover or something like that. I think those are important learning moments for quarterbacks. But maybe that's why I'm not a football coach either. Maybe there is something they can take away from it. But yeah, I think as the season progresses and, maybe in the next week or two, they should probably lock in on one guy over the other.
Yeah, John, I like how you brought up the bye week, because I wonder how much that did factor in. Maybe they had more of a chance to implement the two system quarterbacks because of the bye week. Or maybe it was just something that they were trying out because Northern Colorado wasn't much of an opponent, so it wouldn't have mattered. Maybe they're seeing what they got. Who knows? But I do think the bye week definitely played a factor into them rolling out Hayat. But we'll see what happens next couple of games. Mentioning bye weeks, there was a lot of teams on bye week last week, as we just had 3 games on the slate. Who do you think benefited most from the time off and should start the rest of the season off pretty strong after the last bye of the season, John?
Well, I feel like the teams that benefited the most from this bye week, I think it's got to be a tie between NAU and Weber State, just because they're facing off this week. So it gives them each that extra week to kind of prepare for each other. That's a pretty big conference game this weekend. So just being able to work on maybe new wrinkles, be able to kind of game plan out those first 2 drives are going to be very beneficial for both those teams, especially since both of them have had trouble at times, figuring out which team is going to appear. We've had Weber State come out and put up 55 points against Montana, and we've had Weber State come out and lose to Northern Colorado. So, Northern Arizona struggled at home to Idaho State, but then they've gone out and won big games. So, it gives each team a chance to kind of work on that game plan and focus ahead of a very crucial game.
Yeah, well, if we have this question next week, I know what the answer is, and it'll be Idaho, because they're so banged up that they'll take advantage of this week to get healthy, hopefully. As for the 6 teams that had byes last week, Montana State probably wishes it didn't have a bye. I mean, they've had no close games since the New Mexico. They're on a pretty good roll. UC Davis is 7 straight wins. I'd say, kind of like John said, Weber probably benefited from the bye. I mean, they're 2 straight losses after their big win against Montana. They probably could have used a reset, and that might help them out a whole lot.
Yeah, I also I think NAU probably benefited the most, I guess. They just went through a pretty tough stretch of games, and now the toughest part of the season is behind them. They've got Weber State coming up, and then Cal Poly, Northern Colorado, and Eastern Washington. I think it's a good time to kind of reset and really refocus as they get into the tail end of this regular season for them.
I'm going to go with the Bobcats. I know they had a lot of momentum going. They're 8-0. And but looking at their depth chart, Adam Jones isn't on it this week. Julius Davis is, but Adam Jones didn't play 2 weeks ago, so he had an extra week to get healthy. He's a really good running back for him. And then the other guy that made his reappearance is Bryce Grebe at linebacker, which is where they lost a key player 2 weeks ago. So I think the break came at a good time for the Bobcats in terms of health. So I'm going to go with them.
All right. Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of the Big Sky Now podcast. I want to thank my panel for joining us. Join us again on Thursday. We will break down this upcoming weekend's slate of games. A lot of games unlike last week, so it should be a good weekend and another fun episode. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you on Thursday.